giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dogs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles, with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Welcome in On the Beat. Cody Chaffins and Mike Griffith with you. After a week off, Mike, we are back. You feeling refreshed?
Refreshed as ever. Can't wait for the week.
Good stuff. Got a lot of good stuff coming up on today's show. We are going to get into the Combine coming up later this week and which Georgia players have been kind of rising up draft boards and which ones have been falling down. We'll talk about that. We'll get Mike to weigh in on this playoff change that is coming and what he thinks about all that. We'll also talk about Paul Finebaum, your friend Paul Finebaum's comments about Mike Bobo coming up later in the show. But let's start with Mike. You may need to be holding up like a newspaper with today's date. You are in enemy territory right now.
Yeah, I'm in Gainesville, Florida. And, a lot of Georgia people haven't been here that follow football because they haven't played here in, 30 years, I suppose. There was the home and home when the Gator Bowl was under construction. But here for the Steve Spurrier Award, it goes to the best first-year coach in the country, and a former Georgia coach, Fran Brown, won that award. And he must be a pretty good coach because he developed Jackson Meeks into a 1,000-yard receiver, something Georgia hasn't had during the Kirby tenure. But Fran did the best job of all the coaches that were in their first year coaching at a school. And then we also present a Legends Award. So Frank Beamer will be here for that, the former Virginia Tech coach. We present the most outstanding freshman defensive player, special teams player, and offensive player. The defensive player, Leonard Floyd. So Marcus Freeman will be here to introduce his cornerback. The Clemson kicker will be here. So Dabo is making the flight down to introduce him. And Lenore Sellers was our offensive freshman of the year from South Carolina. So Shane Beamer will be here. And, of course, Steve Spurrier will be here to lead the presentation and have a lot of fun with a lot of these Gators. And I'm sure at some point or another I'll probably hear one Georgia joke or another. And at some point or another I'll probably tell them a joke and put it on the Gators a little bit. So it's that kind of night. It's an award show. It should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's not a Steve Spurrier night if he's not throwing in Georgia jokes. But what is it like to see some of these guys? You talked about Shane Beamer and Dabo, kind of on a more relaxed night. What kind of things do you find out about these coaches on these kind of nights?
Well, the coaches stay pretty true to form. We had Bob Stoops a couple of years ago, and he was a bit of a statue. I mean, that's who Bob Stoops is. He's not a lot of personality. But, of course, last year we had Mark Richt win the Legends Award, and he was outstanding. He's very personable and warm, and him and Coach Spurrier had some fun exchanges. So the coaches I've found pretty much stay in character. I think, tonight's show, which I think we're going to stream on SEC Country Facebook page at 7, coaches stay true to form. Shane Beamer is very personable. Dabo is Dabo. I think Marcus Freeman is excited to be here. I think this is, his first venture down here to Gainesville. Of course, he played at Ohio State. I don't think Notre Dame's ever played a game in the Swamp. I think they played the Gators in a Sugar Bowl. I think Spurrier told me, and I think he remembered they lost. They wore their green jerseys. He went into all these details of the game. I couldn't. He's got a memory like a computer. But I think it's going to be fun, to have this number of coaches here interacting with one another. It's the off season. Everybody's kind of catching their last breaths before the start of spring football and celebrating some upcoming young players that made an impact this season and doing it in one setting. There'll probably be, I'd guess, 15 or 20 former Florida players. All the quarterbacks seem to come back. I usually see Danny Werfel here, and Doug Johnson's usually here. Terry Dean has made it before. So it's a lot of fun. And the Florida fans that come out and sponsors, of course, they're remembering the 1990s when Steve Spurrier won 6 out of 12 SEC championships that he competed for, which was quite a run. I think he won 4 in a row and went to 5 in a row. But, the real interesting thing for me as a Georgia beat writer is that Coach Spurrier is a big fan of Kirby. And it's not just the visor. He mentions the visor often, that Kirby wears a visor. But he likes that Kirby's a former player that leads his program, and he likes the way Georgia plays. So he's a big fan of Kirby Smart's. He was the coach a few weeks ago, you'll remember, that said all these people down on Georgia are crazy. Winning the SEC is the second hardest thing to do, and said that the only coach who could say he had a better year than Kirby Smart's Ryan Day, and he said he had to have 2 do-overs to do it. So, Spurrier, believe it or not, an advocate for this Georgia football team this year and what they accomplished.
Yeah, Kirby haven't perfected the visor flip yet, and hopefully he doesn't. He usually tries to, keep it on during games. But it got me.
Cody, if those players from the other team would just get out of the way, he might have room to flip the visor.
Yeah, he doesn't need to flip the visor. If he's got the Kirby shoulder he can throw into somebody. Could be interesting, too, with Beamer and Dabo down there together. You get some rivals together as well. But because you're at this event, it kind of got me thinking, because Fran Brown was on this staff last year, the year before this past season, of course. He had turnover there, but he goes and he wins the Spurrier Award. And it was actually one of two assistant coaches who weren't even a coordinator who went on to become head coaches off of last year's team. And this year, there's no turnover on the coaching staff, at least as of yet. Dog fans, there is no news in that department. But it got me to thinking, who could be the next Fran Brown on this coaching staff? Because it's fun to kind of go through and think about. And you think about the coordinators. Well, it's not going to be Mike Bobo. I think he's kind of been there, done that with going to do his head coaching thing. So Glenn Schumann kind of sticks out as the number one, but there's some other guys too that are kind of down there. Glenn Schumann, I'm sure, has had opportunities at this point. When do you think he will make that jump? What is holding him back from making that jump to becoming a head coach?
Well, I think a couple things. I mean, for Glenn Schumann, you've got a young family. I think his wife, gave birth within the last year and a half or so, and I think he has multiple kids. And I think that it's a little more settled. I don't think you want to move around a lot. It obviously has to be a great offer. I don't think Dan Lanning would have left for anything less than a tremendous offer. And of course, Oregon was just that. I think Travaris Robertson's another guy that could be a head coach. I don't know if coming off this year, but Schumann does seem to be the guy, but I think it's a matter of opportunity. You look at Kirby Smart and how many years he stayed at Alabama. Certainly Kirby had a lot of opportunities before he left to come to Georgia and get the job that he wanted. But if you're an assistant coach on a staff that's this stable, with a coach like Kirby Smart, with the facilities Georgia has and the community that Georgia is to live in around Athens, I don't think you're in any rush to give it up just to become a head coach. I think you're going to be very selective. So I kind of think that's what you're going to see from Glenn Schumann.
Yeah, and we see Sam Pittman, his run looked like it was near the end, and then he brings in Petrino and kind of saves his job last season. But Dan Lanning's in a good spot, like you mentioned. And I feel like you're going to make good money as the coordinator at Georgia now. Like, that's going to be no question, right? And the way I feel like college football is right now and the way the world is right now, you're not going to have much time to prove yourself. If you can't get it done in a year or two, you're going to be gone, and then you're looking for another job that's not going to be as good as the Georgia job that you left to take that head coaching job. So it does seem like you've got to find the right fit, because if it doesn't work, everywhere is very quick to fire somebody.
Yeah, that's a great point. When I was looking up some stuff on Dabo for tonight's presentation, I'll get to speak on each one of these guys. He didn't win the ACC until his 8th year. And, however many years later, 17 years later, he's got 2 national championships and 5 conference championships. And so sometimes it takes time. And to your point, Cody, I don't think coaches are afforded that much time. I'm not sure, NIL, should that speed the clock or should it delay it a little bit, because it's harder to retain players. It's hard to build a program when guys are leaving year in and year out for more money at other programs. If you do too good of a job like Kirby has, you have a lot of these juniors that are going pro early. You're not getting these guys for 4 years. So, you're getting them a little later, maybe as transfers. There's not as much time for development. And then a lot of them are going to go pro early. And that's what we saw happen to this Georgia class. And, why you've got, 14 dogs at the combine, which I think ties a program record for the most ever.
Schumann, they call the professor. Do you feel like he has that, he gets in front of the microphone. I think he's really well spoken. He's really interesting the times we actually do get to hear from him, which is beginning of the year and end of the year with the way Georgia has it set up. Do you feel like he has that it factor as a head coach?
Really hard to say. I like Coach Schumann a lot. I think he's still on the young side to be a head coach, but he certainly put the time in, and he's been around great staffs. And obviously Kirby Smart trusts him, a tremendous amount. He got to work with Will Muschamp as well. So, Schu's been in the right places with the right coaches. His players play hard for him. He's developed some great talent. He's recruited some great talent at his position, linebackers coach, and he's put a lot of guys in the NFL. As for the disposition and the CEO quality, certainly I think he has the aptitude for that. When I think of Schu right now, I think of an X's and O's guy that loves the essence of the game. If you've ever, Google searched him talking to coaching clinics, you'll understand why they call him the professor. His football IQ is off the charts. He's brilliant. But as we know, managing a team requires more than that, and a lot of charisma and a lot more to fall back on. And I just don't think we've seen Coach Schumann tested in that area enough to know. I think it speaks well for him to see what Dan Lanning accomplished. But Dan also had some different stops. Glenn's experience is somewhat limited in terms of the kind of programs he's been at, and the types of coaches he's worked with the best. So what does he do if you take the best away? I think he would do fine. I think he would do well. Clearly, he's a good recruiter and he knows his stuff. But getting back to the question, I don't think he's in any hurry to go anywhere. I think it would have to be a really good offer, and it would probably have to be coming off of a little bit stronger year. I say stronger finish in the college football playoff, because obviously perception's a big deal when you make these hires.
Yeah, he obviously has the charisma enough to recruit an incredible linebacker room. Georgia's stocked right now at linebacker. I was kind of going through some of the other coaches and thinking who might be the guy. Todd Hartley is a name. You talk about great recruiters. It does feel like it's, could be in his future, the way he obviously can lead men, and the tight ends at Georgia have been so strong. Trey Scott, another guy who's been there a long time. I don't know if he has head coaching, that's something he wants to do down the line, but he's another guy who's just seems he can relate to players a lot, which I think is a big part of being a head coach. And T-Rob, who you mentioned, Tavares Robinson, he has the pedigree as well, has worked at Alabama, worked for Nick Saban, and he kind of knows what it's like. And that's what, a lot of programs want to find a guy who's worked for Nick Saban or now worked for Kirby Smart, because they trust that coaching tree.
Well, obviously, Scott Cochran just got hired at West Alabama.
Yeah.
On that was hired. But again, we're talking about what types of job would you leave Georgia for? I don't think anybody would leave the Georgia staff. No offense to Coach Cochran, but I don't think anybody would leave the Georgia staff for West Alabama or a program at that level. I think they would want to go to another program where they would have a chance to win championships. And those jobs are few and far between. I think Fran taking the Syracuse job, obviously he made an immediate impact. He's got a vision. He's got great experience. I think Syracuse is ready to spend some money. I think that was a great move for him. And, him winning this award, there were some other really good candidates. The Indiana head coach was a candidate for this job. Yeah. And they made the college football playoff. And, the Duke head coach was a candidate for this job. And the Boise State head coach was a candidate for this award. And yet it was Fran who won it. Coach Spurrier feeling really good about naming him the first-year coach of the year.
Yeah, Fran called out Kirby Smart after one of his biggest wins of the year. Kirby said their kids are still friends, right? And that's why the really reason they still have a nice connection, which is really cool to hear as well. All right, so Mike is in Gainesville now. Later this week, we'll be headed up to Indianapolis for the NFL Combine. We got 14 dogs at the Combine this year, and we got to see some of those guys and hear from some of those guys at the Senior Bowl. But this week, we get to hear from those first-round guys, and it's kind of interesting to now look at all the mock drafts. It's fun when there are Georgia guys in all the mock drafts. And you're talking about Malachi Starks, Jalen Walker, Mykel Williams, all expected to go first round. And, depending on which mock draft you look at, one guy's going first or it's the other guy. The last I saw, Jalen Walker is really high up there, and for good reason.
Well, he's versatile. I think Mykel Williams is better at that position. But when you get a guy like Jalen that can do so many different things, there's more value there. And also there's a higher likelihood of a team picking him. So if you're trying to project who's going to pick who, and you got a guy like Jalen Walker that can play two positions, it increases the number of teams that are going to be in the pool to draft that position in the first round. So I could see that. A lot of people feel like Mykel has a very high ceiling that he hasn't reached yet. He had that injury this year, and he had another injury-plagued year at Georgia, but they love his hands. They love his size and his power. We talk about Jalen. We talk about football IQ and athleticism and versatility. And then we talk about Malachi Starks. And again, we're talking about a versatile guy that can play more than one position in the secondary. We expect he's going to have a very good combine. He's a very athletic player. I think a lot of where Malachi goes in the draft is going to be dependent on the combine that he has. I think he's slid a little bit this year, maybe from mid-first round to late first round in a lot of these mocks I'm seeing. But who knows, right? All it takes is one team to like you.
Yeah, I've seen Malachi mocked as high as third, as low as 32nd. So his is wide open. Now, a lot of times, these first-round guys will not necessarily do all of the testing at the Combine because they don't want to run a slow 40 on a place they're not familiar, but they'll get out there and do some drills. We'll see them do that. From those guys, is there anything we have to see out of those guys to prove themselves? And I think the one area all three will do really well is the interviews with GMs and head coaches in Indianapolis.
Well, the truth is probably the most important thing for all three is something that we won't see, and that's the medical exam. They do a very deep dive into a kid's medical history and to see where he's at with his injuries. And again, particularly with Mykel Williams as well as Malachi, these are two players that have had some injuries during their career that didn't seem to affect them the way they were playing. But, those teams are picky. They want to get in there and check that out. You remember Geez, it was just a few years ago when Nakobe Dean slid all the way down to the third round, and there were some differences of opinions among team doctors. Some teams felt like he'd need surgery before his first season. The Eagles disagreed, obviously, and they got an absolute steal getting Nakobe Dean. I believe it was the third round. So we've seen that affect draft stock before. I don't anticipate that. I wonder a little bit about Tate Ratledge. Tate turned down a Senior Bowl invite and didn't really give a reason. He was the guy that really needed to be there to help himself out in that draft order among the guards. Dylan Fairchild wasn't there either. I think both of those guys might have been a little beat up. Jared Wilson, another guy, missed some time this year. That physical is going to be important depending on the mock draft you look at. He'll be the first or the second center off the board. But how high up, right? Teams don't typically draft centers high unless they feel like they're special. So I think Jared Wilson is another guy who has a lot to gain from the NFL Combine.
So I was on NFL Mock Draft, a database, I think is what it's called, and it kind of is tracked where these guys have been ranked from November of last year until now. And it was interesting to see which guys have gone up and which guys have gone down. And you talked about Tate Ratledge. There's only like 4 Georgia Bulldogs whose ranking right now is lower than it was in November. And that's Tate Ratledge, Xavier Truss on the offensive line, and then the defensive linemen, Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson. Now, not all of them have gone down dramatically. I mean, there's nobody falling off a cliff here, but everybody else has gone up at least a little bit. We'll talk about Arian Smith in a minute, but he took a huge jump. But it's interesting to me, those guys on the lines of scrimmage, Tate, Truss on the offense, and Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse, from November of last year till now, those are the guys who have gone down. Do you feel like that's because there were so high expectations for those guys going into the season?
Well, maybe, but it probably has more to do with the schedule they played and how they looked on film. I mean, when you look at the depth of the SEC, I mean, it's the deepest I've ever seen the league, the most parity. So maybe they weren't as dominant as a lot of people projected. And, to be fair to Warren and Nazir, they had big shoes to fill. I mean, they ain't Jalen Carter or Devontae Wyatt or Jordan Davis. No, they're not. They're a level down from that. They never developed, to that level. But very few people do, in all fairness. I think, Nazir and Warren were adequate. I think Georgia could have won a national championship with them, but not because of them, nor necessarily in spite of them. I will say the one guy you didn't mention, who is the highest projected player in the draft for Georgia this year, is now playing football at Miami. And wasn't that an unexpected turn when you think about it? Right, Carson Beck is the number 1 overall projected pick. And, he's now he's down at, Miami, I guess, dealing with a car insurance person or something.
Yeah, really interesting. We'll talk about Arian Smith. I was going to go looking at that. So they put it on a graph on this website. And his jump after the Senior Bowl, I think at the end of the season, he was like 490 as like top player. He is now 232 after the Senior Bowl. And that's one of those guys who this week could make that go even higher. Oh,
yeah. And I expect Arian, I put the over-under for Arian on a 40 time at about 4.23. I think I've heard tell he may run a 4.21. He could set an NFL Combine record. And he worked so hard and did so well at the Senior Bowl. I know Georgia fans would have been really proud of him. I don't know how many of them look at our videos on YouTube, but if you get a chance, go to our YouTube page and you'll get an opportunity to see Arian Smith interviewed down there, as well as Dan Jackson, and all the other Bulldogs that were down there, Trevor Etienne. And you really get a chance, Smile Munden, to really know these guys because now they're not standing behind a Georgia podium and they're not talking about the team. They're talking about themselves. All those guys represented themselves really well. The thing I liked about what Arian said, though, is he took full accountability. He said, there were some drop passes. There were. He said, but you know what? There were also some really good plays, and I have to think positive. But yes, he was accountable for the mistakes he made, but he also said, hey, I made some good plays too, and that's what I'm going to try to focus on. He's obviously got to get some confidence back. I thought he caught the ball relatively well at the Senior Bowl, and I think his speed was on display, just like it was a year ago for Ladd McConkey when they couldn't keep up with Ladd. Obviously, you see Arian, a little bit more trouble coming off a jam, but once you get him in the open field, he can really stretch it out, and he made some really nice catches over some defenders.
You need your guy Jim Nagy to be calling the NFL Combine, show him some love for Dan Jackson. Dan just gets totally snubbed out of the Combine this week. It'll be interesting to hear the Georgia guys, because we already saw some tweets about it from like a guy like Warren Brinson. How do they keep him out? But I'm sure all of those guys will have so many great things to say about Dan Jackson.
Oh, there's no doubt. And, I actually reached out to Jim, about a comment for that. And he said, well, listen, he said, you know how I feel. He said, I don't want to criticize their process because they don't criticize mine, just out of professional courtesy. But, remember Jim Nagy was the guy that said, told me way back mid-season, I'm inviting Dan Jackson to this game. He's not getting a lot of NFL buzz. He feels like Dan's been somewhat stereotyped. Dan will have an opportunity to prove himself at the Georgia Pro Day. I had a short exchange with Dan about this, and, he's confident things will work out. He's going to work even harder. It's just kind of like another chapter, to the Dirty Dan story. And I know the Georgia fans and his teammates are going to be pulling for him. But to your point, Nagy, the Senior Bowl executive director, who also recently interviewed for the New York Jets general manager job, he's got a lot of belief in Dan Jackson. And Jim has been pretty sharp with his analysis and picking these guys out. And remember, Cody, it was just, 4 or 5 years ago that Tate Crowder didn't get invited, right. The linebacker. He ended up being the very last pick of the draft. They call that Mr. Irrelevant. And by his second year in the NFL, he led the New York Giants in tackles. Yeah,
looking at some of the guys and where they're projected to be drafted, at least at this point, Tate, who we talked about, has fallen down, still projected a third rounder. Jared Wilson, Dylan Fairchild, and at least the stuff I've seen, projected fourth. Etienne, a fifth rounder, Munden, a fourth rounder, and the rest of the guys they have going as undrafted. But I do wonder, after watching the Philly Dogs and what they did, will there be an after effect of these GMs just saying, when in doubt, take a dog, right?
Well, no doubt. I mean, because all these guys play multiple positions. That's one of the things Kirby, does for his players, is he has them play multiple positions because he realizes that's going to raise their stock. They all play special teams. They're all very good on special teams. And when you're an NFL team with a 53-man roster, you're going to need some of those guys to pick up some of those duties. So they know how to practice. They compete against the best. They compete against future first-round draft picks every day in practice. They compete in the toughest conference, and they play for a really tough coach. Let's face it, Kirby's not a softie. I mean, he is really on their tails every day, and that's a lot of the NFL. It's a business, right? And they learn that at Georgia. So Georgia guys have shown that they transition well into the NFL with their coachability, their position versatility, their ability and willingness to play special teams. And like you said, just that championship air, when you look at what the Eagles have done with the Philly Dogs, well, heck, throw the Rams out there. I mean, there's other teams. Green Bay Packers probably a better example with a lot of Georgia guys. Mm-hmm. You saw what Kamari Lassiter did with the Texans. You saw what Tyke Smith did for the Bucs. Of course, everybody took note of Brock Bowers, and everyone took note of Ladd McConkey. There was a lot of impact Georgia players that were rookies this year. Javon Bullard did a nice job. So I do think that it does carry weight to be a Georgia player, and I think what you just said is absolutely true. If there's two guys and you're trying to pick between the two, all things being equal, you're going to take the guy that's played in the Georgia program for Kirby Smart.
Really well said. And some of the guys I didn't even think about, everybody is proving that is the right choice to do with the way they're all performing. So really good stuff there. Mike going to be at the Combine. Kaylee Mansell will be up there. We will have stuff from them every day on the Combine on our DawgNation YouTube channels as well. Everything those guys get in front of the media, and they would get to hear from some of those guys for the first time since the season. We'll have all that on our DawgNation YouTube channels as well. When we come back, we're going to get Mike's thoughts on the changes coming to the college football playoff. But before we do, this is On the Beat, presented by Ingles.
It's the moment you dream of, the moment you work for, train for, run wind sprints when nobody's watching for, the moment when hours of gym time, court time, prep time all culminate into this time, the moment when millions of bounces, blocks, and boards all add up to this, your moment. Ingles, we're with you every step of the way.
All right, welcome back into On the Beat. We're going to get to what Mike's friend Paul Finebaum had to say about Georgia's offensive coordinator in just a minute. Before we do that, the big changes, since we didn't have a show last week, we haven't gotten to talk about this at all, but proposed changes out there for the 2026 college football playoff, which will include automatic bids for the SEC and Big Ten, 4 seeds each for each of those, 2 for the ACC, 2 for the Big 12, and a couple of kind of at-large bids as well. Mike, when you see the change from 12 to 14 or 16, which we could see in the Big Ten and SEC kind of teaming up together to do all this, what was your initial reaction?
Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, at the end of the day, it's about money, Cody. You've been in the TV industry for a long time, and we're very fortunate to have your skills on the DawgNation channel. But you understand how it works, right? At the end of the day, you've got to have revenue, and television revenue is a big part of not just collegiate sports, but all professional sports and entertainment. So, there'd been a lot of conversation about going to a ninth game in the SEC. They were kind of split on that a couple of years ago in Destin, and ultimately after last year, everybody said, what are you, crazy? I mean, you saw Ole Miss get left out, and South Carolina and Alabama because they had 3 losses, even though they might have been one of the 12 best. So you're saying, okay, well, wait a minute. Why would you add another conference game if the selection committee isn't going to value your schedule? Well, one way around that is to guarantee 4 bids and say, okay, now you're definitely going to get 4 bids. So even if you have 3 losses, you can get in. And if you have a lot of parity in your conference, you can get in. And that would free the SEC up to add that 9th conference game. And while it may not seem like a big deal, from a revenue standpoint, it is, because that will make the television contract worth more money for the SEC, and hence more money they can distribute to school to pay coaches and players. So to me, that's a lot of it. 2, I think that, you hear the talk about a potential play-in game or 2. I don't know what to think about that. You'd really almost have to start the season in August and drop another team. I do think, you recently saw Tennessee and Nebraska cancel home and home. I do think you'll see more of that in terms of teams canceling, those attractive opening games. We saw Georgia play Oregon or Georgia play Clemson. Unfortunately, I think those games go by the wayside, because if you're going to add that 9th conference game, something's got to go. You kind of need the cream puff games to get your guys right, to get some experience, build some depth. And, there's been a lot of talk about Georgia Tech. And, at the end of the day, a lot of Georgia people just don't think you can cancel that series. So that's going to be your home and home. Instead of a future home and home with Clemson, you're going to have a home and home with Georgia Tech every year in the name of tradition, it appears.
In that game, there are those talks about what would happen at the end of the season. Would a 6-play, a 3 and a 5-4, and these crossover kind of play in to the playoff games. And you can't have that if you have Georgia Tech at the end of the season. So that game almost certainly would have to be moved earlier in the season, if not to the beginning of the season every year. But the thing about that crossover, and there's nothing definite on any of that, it would make for interesting football, but it's kind of the same issue we ran into with the college football playoff. All of a sudden, you're just going to schedule a game, and the stadium has to be ready, and it has to be, they got to have enough hot dogs, they got to have enough security. These college towns are built around these certain Saturdays going on in the fall, and to just either lose one right at the end or spring one on somebody seems like it would be really, really tough logistically.
Yeah, I was going to say the logistics are a nightmare. And from what I heard, the stadiums did a pretty nice job with that, but they're not as prepared as, the host sites that we typically go to. And, whether it's Phoenix for the Fiesta Bowl or Miami for the Orange Bowl or New Orleans for the Sugar Bowl or Pasadena for the Rose Bowl, Cotton Bowl in Fort Worth, Arlington, those Peach Bowl, Atlanta, those sites understand how to put on a game. And the hidden secret is they've sold about 60% of their tickets before the teams are even announced. Whereas when you talk about playoff games on home campus stadium, you start with 0 because you don't know whether or not you're going to host or not. In addition to the logistics, you're starting with 0 versus, those major bowl cities that already have 60% of the tickets sold. So I suppose there's things you could do provisionally with your season ticket holders or donors or what have it in the event that you make the playoff. You're on the list to purchase. But that is a challenge. At the end of the day, though, I don't think the attendance is going to be what holds it up. What it matters is what the television executives want, what they feel they could sell, and if the schools feel like the juice is worth the squeeze in terms of adding that extra game to get that extra revenue.
I think the one thing that we noticed, which we've kind of known for a while, right, is that the Big Ten and SEC are in a whole different world, stratosphere, than the teams like in the ACC and the Big 12. And by agreeing to this, the ACC and the Big 12 are essentially saying, yeah, we're not as good, which is crazy to me that they would go along with it. It was interesting to me on DawgNation Daily this morning to hear Brandon Adams, because I kind of been for it because I want to see better games. And you see another SEC game instead of, I think that's a good thing. But for him, he did not like that. He felt like the SEC was coming back to meet the Big 12 or the Big 10, sorry. Do you feel like the SEC is giving up its top spot just to kind of come back to the Big 10?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question. because if we were really going to make the argument over the last 2 years, the Big Ten's had the national champion. And even though I would tell you, I don't think Ohio State would have won the national championship if they played in the SEC. If you gave Ohio State Georgia's schedule, I don't think they would have made the playoff. I really don't think there's much debate about that. But because of the lack of the depth in the Big Ten, they didn't have the same issue with attrition. They were able to lose 2 of their 3 biggest games of the year, not even play in the Big Ten championship. And it's one thing we learned is that the byes really didn't help out. All 4 teams with a bye lost, which was interesting. I don't believe any of the conference champions made the Final Four, if I'm not mistaken. Notre Dame didn't play in a conference, of course. So you wonder what role the conference championship played in that extra game at the end of the season. As far as coming back to the Big Ten, again, the last 2 years you had Michigan and Ohio State win it. For what it's worth, they were the national champs. Now, again, I wouldn't make the argument that the Big Ten's better. I think it's more about television markets, Cody. When you look at the Big Ten and you think about the largest television markets in the country, you start out with New York. And because Big Ten has Rutgers, they have that market. You go to number 2, and I believe that's Los Angeles. And you saw the Big Ten had USC and UCLA. You go to number 3, and we're talking about Chicago. And the Big Ten has Northwestern. You go to number 4, and I'm pretty sure that's Houston. And I guess we could say Texas A&M or Texas, or 5, Dallas, Fort Worth, again, Texas A&M audiences. So right there, I think the reason that the value of these contracts is so high and the reason that you're seeing these guaranteed bids is because it's going to raise the value of the championship playoff package because you're going to be in the largest television markets in the country. So it's not just about what's on the field. I think it's also about what you can sell and how much money you can generate. And if you're an SEC or a Big Ten fan, you should feel good about that because it guarantees that you're going to be the 2 premium conferences and have the highest payouts to pay your coaches, to pay your players. They're talking about a salary cap, but what does that mean? Some booster can't pay money on the side? Well, of course they will, can. So to getting back to your question, I think it has as much to do about television market share as it does recent results. And if we're looking at recent results, what do we got to go back to? 2019, since an ACC team won it in Clemson. So the last 6 years have been either Big Ten or SEC national champions.
I know you've lamented how this sport has kind of just become a playoff sport, and this seems to only make that bigger. Do you agree?
No doubt, but this is where we're at. We have free agency every year. We're going to have this designated number, salary cap number that schools are going to be able to offer an NIL. I think the next step after that is I think you got to have contracts for players. I mean, if you're going to go out and pay $600,000 for a freshman, and I think Georgia has, and I think other programs have paid even more, even for quarterbacks, you need to have some sort of guarantee. Otherwise, you're not paying that $600,000 for a freshman because he's going to outperform the senior that's only making $300,000. You're doing it because you want the opportunity to coach that guy through his career. Well, you need a guarantee of some sort that he's not going to leave your program early. Because right now, the reason we're here is because amateurism didn't hold up to federal work laws. Well, the way to answer that is with a contract that will hold up in court. So, for example, you pay a guy $600,000 and you say, okay, here's the deal. This guarantees you're going to stay with us for 3 years. And if you leave after year 1, you got a $300,000 buyout. And if another program wants you, they're going to have to pay the University of Georgia $300,000 to take you away. Well, now the other programs may not be so quick to want to pluck or take away. And if you're Georgia and you lose a guy that you think is capable or competent, you go, well, at least we just added $300,000 to our salary pool. So, yes, this is sounding a lot like professional sports. And to me, it's the only way you can go because of the Supreme Court ruling a few years back that set the wheels in motion for NIL and portal dealings.
To kind of go back to our first topic, if I'm Glenn Schumann too, an assistant coach sounds so much nicer than renegotiating a contract with every kid on your roster every year and also trying to find other kids to bring in. And I'm sure they're doing part of that too. But it just, what an insane, you're right. You got to have some kind of guarantee of a contract, even if it's 2 years. Just make sure somebody's staying around so I don't have to renegotiate.
Well, and I think that's part of the reason why Kirby focused more in state. And not to say that, that there won't be some in-state kids that want to transfer, but at least you take the homesickness element out of it. You add in that the family will be at the games. Families often have a great deal of influence over the players. And families that's been used to going to their kids' games for 2 or 3 years, they're not going to want them to transfer to, UCLA where they got to travel across the country, So I think that there's a strategy. There's always a strategy behind what Kirby's doing. But, you look at the in-state talent in Georgia, it's premium. And you look at the likelihood of player retention. And if a kid's from in-state, I think it's probably higher. But I'm sure he's done those studies, and I'm sure that's what they tell him.
All right, we'll talk about Kirby Smart and his loyalty in just a minute. Before we do, we want to thank Daytona Beach for being a part of On the Beat this week. Daytona Beach is 23 miles of Atlantic shoreline, and there's so much to get done as you head down to the Atlantic coast there. You can fly into Daytona Beach International Airport, or you can just make the short drive down from Georgia or the Atlanta area. You can go kayaking, play some golf, do some fishing off the pier. My grandmother used to love to do that fishing off the pier. She had a timeshare, was down in Daytona Beach so much. Watch something going on at the band shell, hear the band playing while you're sitting out there looking at the waves as well. Looks like a great place to be this time of year. If you want to get the best deal at Daytona Beach, go to DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. You get down there for the cheap. That's the way to do it. DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. Well, Mike, you know Paul Finebaum well, and you've been on his show, and you've said some provocative things to him, and he said some provocative things back to you. Well, it was on Atlanta radio this week. He put some provocative things out there, a little spicy, as he said Kirby Smart was being too loyal to Mike Bobo, and he could find a better offensive coordinator just walking down Peachtree Street. What do you make of the comments? Is he playing a little radio, having fun, making a little TV, or is there a nugget of truth in there?
The Mike Bobo question is complex in the sense that Mike Bobo didn't drop those passes. Mike Bobo, you could fault him maybe, that Carson maybe didn't appear as ready for the season or put in the amount of work that maybe, ideally he would have with those other receivers. But how much control do you really have over these players in the offseason? I mean, those aren't supervised workouts. Mike Bobo wasn't the guy that recruited Carson back. His relationship time with him is relatively limited. He's not the guy that worked with him as a freshman, as a sophomore, and built him. Mike Bobo's not the guy that had, saw every offensive lineman miss at least 1 week with injury. So it's tough to put all this on Mike. The reality of it is when you look at what Georgia accomplished in spite of the top two receivers being suspended, in spite of leading the nation in drop passes, in spite of using 5 different offensive line combinations, in spite of losing their starting quarterback in the first half and trailing, having to come back and beat Texas, in spite of losing 2 of your 4 scholarship backs, and they win the SEC in the most competitive era ever, you look at the glass half full and say, wow, he actually did a pretty good job. When I think about the games that Georgia lost, I don't really know how much of that I put all on Mike Bobo's shoulders. Let's remember, Cody, this is the worst run defense Kirby's had in 8 years. So your defense wasn't getting the offense off the field as often as they have in past years. The turnover total was very low. The Dogs didn't force nearly as many turnovers to put the offense in good situations. So there were other factors outside of Mike Bobo. But firing the offensive coordinator, let's face it, it's the easiest thing to do. It's the lowest hanging fruit. It's the easiest coach to second guess. And beyond that, you don't even know what type of input Kirby Smart had in the offense and what type of limits Kirby had on Mike. Because at the end of the day, this is Kirby's team. Don't kid yourself. He's going to tell these coaches what he wants in terms of run-pass ratio, in terms of how aggressive he wants him to coach. So I just think Mike Bobo's getting blamed for a lot. As far as the ease of replacing Mike Bobo with enough offensive coordinator, I'd say who? Who do you grab that you just plug in this web? Well, what about Todd Monken? Well, you know what? Todd Monken stunk it up against Marcus Freeman in Cincinnati for 3 quarters in the Peach Bowl. Everybody's got amnesia about the games Todd Monken didn't do well in, or the 2020 COVID season. Stetson had a couple of 3 interception games, and you think about even the national championship game. Georgia didn't get in the end zone until there was 3 minutes left in the third quarter. And that was after, I believe, Jalen Carter blocked a field goal and James Cook ripped off a 67-yard run. So even Todd Monken had his challenges. So that's why I say I think it's low-hanging fruit. I think you have to trust Kirby Smart to make the decisions that are best for the staff. I respect Paul. He's got opinions like anyone. From the outside looking in, Maybe that's the perception, but when you dig a little deeper and you look at the defensive drop-off, you look at the number of injuries, and you look at the inconsistency at the quarterback position, I think you realize that Mike Bobo had a lot to manage. And the fact that Georgia won an SEC championship in spite of all that, to me, is a feather in Mike Bobo's cap.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, too, that it's a knock on Kirby Smart for being too loyal, which is something you ask for from anybody, right? And you think about Kirby, if that's your thing to knock me down is I'm too loyal as a player, you want to go play for a guy that's loyal to people. And I think about, a guy like Jonathan Ledbetter, who could have been kicked off the team when he got in trouble his freshman year. Kirby was loyal to him. He ends up playing in the NFL, right? Going through the way at Georgia. And
let me say this. It's easy to say that because Mike goes back with Kirby a long time, but the only thing I know that Kirby Smart's loyal to is winning. At the end of the day, you can say whatever you want. You remember a few years ago, Cody, when Todd Monken, somebody asked him about being part of the Georgia family, and he said, "Hey, don't kid yourself. If I don't win so many games and score so many points, they're going to fire me. So I don't want to hear about family." So, this whole loyalty thing is a crutch. I understand what people are saying. Gosh, do you really think Kirby would fire a guy? No, he doesn't really fire anybody. He just encourages them to look for other jobs and they leave, if you haven't noticed that. And they don't have any problem finding him because they've been a part of his staff. So if Kirby had a problem with Bobo, he would quietly encourage him to leave. And the next thing you know, Mike Bobo would be popping up as an offensive coordinator somewhere else. So I think that storyline is overblown and inaccurate. The only thing that I know Kirby Smart to be loyal to is winning championships. That's the way this guy's built, and I don't think that'll ever change.
The only other time we heard it about Kirby Smart that he was too loyal to me that I can think of was probably Jake Fromm, Justin Fields, and they said he was too loyal to Jake Fromm. I can't think of another time where he was criticized for being too loyal.
Well, again, that was another, misconstrued story, because people would say, all they ever let Justin Fields do is run. No, actually, passes are called, and Justin is running after the first read, just like he did on the fake punt when he blew that. But again, that's the story within the story, and you can't expect a coach to come out and say, look, Justin's just not able to run the offense yet, and we're trying to do a lot of different things with our receivers because we don't have a personnel that's geared toward a running quarterback like maybe you did when Stetson Bennett was at Georgia. So, again, people that don't dig deep, that don't watch DawgNation daily or read DawgNation.com every day, they may not have the insights. They turn on the game on Saturday. There's a different commentator every Saturday who gets their information from, browsing through a few stories and meeting with the team for a couple days, and they're in and out of town, and you might get them 3 times a year. So I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, especially with social media. Again, a lot of people grabbing at low-hanging fruit, things that look obvious, but then you dig a little bit deeper and you find out that there's much more to the story. It's a lot more complex than people realize. It is rocket science. You never know the health of the players. You never know the circumstances of practice. There's so much information that we don't know that the coaches know. And over the course of time, I look at Kirby Smart's record, and would you believe that Kirby Smart has a better winning percentage at Georgia than Steve Spurrier had at Florida in the 1990s? That blew me away because I thought of Spurrier.
Yeah.
I'm going to leave my presentation in Gainesville tonight with that. But Kirby has a better – I think when I talk about Marcus Freeman – I think this is right, Cody, if I'm not mistaken, check me on this. But since 2019, I believe that the Notre Dame game is the only non-conference game that Kirby Smart's lost in the playoffs or the regular season.
Yeah, it's bad. I can't.
And we're going to question him. And we're going to question him. We're going to question a guy that won. I mean, really, a guy that had, 3 state undefeated regular seasons and won an SEC championship this year, despite that schedule, playing all those top 10 teams on the road, despite the injuries, despite the drop head. Are we really going to sit here as commentators or analysts? And yes, it's our job to ask questions. But at the end of the day, are we really, is some fan on Twitter or X really going to say that they know better than Kirby Smart? I mean, to me, that is, I get it. I love sports. It's part of the fun. Everybody's got opinions. But at the end of the day, if you're asking me whose judgment I trust, I just don't understand how anybody could question the wisdom of the decisions that Kirby Smart makes. If they don't work out, obviously you can second guess. But it wasn't so long ago that I saw him run a fake punt in a tie game against Texas from his own territory, and he was a genius. So that's where I go with it. And that may be an oversimplistic answer, but he's the guy that watches every practice, that knows how healthy every player is, that knows the history of the team they're playing, that knows their tendencies before each play call. And if he's on those headsets and Bobo's calling the plays and Kirby's good with it, I'm trusting it. Or if he's the guy that calls timeout in overtime, as he did against Georgia Tech 2 or 3 times to change things up and cross up Buster Faulkner and completely outcoach Georgia Tech in that overtime, you trust Kirby there. So, I'm not trying to be short-tempered with it, but I'm just trying to say, let's consider who we're questioning here when we start talking about Kirby Smart's judgment and loyalties.
I love how you said it is rocket science, because it is, and it's way more complicated than any of us even probably realize. It's interesting to bring it back to tonight's event for you in Gainesville. Kirby did all that while having to replace coordinators and coaches the whole way through. It's going to be interesting. Marcus Freeman's going to have to start doing that. Now he's lost his defensive coordinator. They got some changes. We'll see how good a coach he is after he loses a coordinator too, right?
No doubt. And I was really impressed with Marcus Freeman's presentation. I thought he sounded a lot like Kirby Smart when he spoke there at the Sugar Bowl. His team was more dialed in and more focused. Let's face it, they caught some breaks. 244 yards of total offense. They didn't have any drives that reached inside the 25-yard line of Georgia. The one that they scored a touchdown on was off of a turnover. I think Marcus is a great coach. He's a third-year coach at Notre Dame. I think he's headed for big things, perhaps the NFL even. But Notre Dame is a private school with their own television contract. They're very well positioned to do well in this NIL game. They tap into that Chicago market heavily, as well as Indianapolis and Detroit because of their location. So that's a school to keep an eye on, and Marcus Freeman is a rising star, as is Fran Brown. Syracuse has got a pretty big market. It's upstate New York, but it's New York, and there's resources, and there's an indoor facility there, and if they put some money into that, they could have something special. So there's some coaches that'll be here tonight on the rise. Shane Beamer, I didn't think his team was going to do anything last year. In full disclosure, I told him that today when he called me. I said, I remember you saying that the media didn't like your team, but you did. And he goes, yeah, well, just remember that. Next year when you guys go pick us, and if you pick us too high and we don't do well, give me a mulligan for that. There's a lot of great coaches here. Dabo Sweeney, a guy that doesn't take transfers, but there he was in the playoff, winning the ACC championship. So it's going to be fun to talk with these coaches. And, anytime you got Steve Spurrier praising Georgia, because for the first couple of years, Cody, I'll tell you in full transparency, he's always liked Kirby, but I'd say, let me write that. And he'd say, well, I don't know. That doesn't sound too good. I don't know if the Gator fans would like that. But now he is a Kirby Smart guy. And he's gotten to play golf with Kirby a couple times, and he's watched him coach. And I think he realized what Kirby's done. And I know he's got a ton of respect for winning the SEC championship last season. Even if a lot of the Georgia fans still look at it as a down year, those SEC titles are very, very hard to come by. Consider Dabo's only got 5 of them in 17 years in the ACC. I believe Steve Spurrier has 8. 6 came at Florida, 2 at Duke. And what is Kirby up to now? I think he's got, 3 SEC championships in his first 9 years, if I'm not mistaken. So I think Kirby Smart's done wonders. And I think Georgia football is in as good a shape as it could possibly be in right now. And hard to second guess the head coach. We may be looking at a transition year, depending on what happens at quarterback, depending on how a lot of this young talent develops. But you can best be assured that Georgia is setting themselves up for a really strong future with a lot of the NIL strategies that Josh Brooks is working on.
All right, Mike, have fun down there tonight. I'm curious. I don't know if I'll ever be welcome at Steve Spurrier's restaurant down there. Have you eaten there? Is the food good at Steve Spurrier's little restaurant?
It's first class, and I'll tell you, this 1990s Florida crowd that comes, I mean, they really love college football, and they miss it. They really miss it.
It's been 30 years now since 95.
Yeah, and it reminds me to tell Georgia fans, I mean, my goodness, I mean, you're complaining about an SEC championship season, and if you look at what this program's done over the last 4 years, I believe they've won 5 games more than Alabama. That's the second best team in the SEC. I mean, these are the good old days. What are we talking about now, Cody? 8 straight years of top 7 finishes, 7 or 8 straight years of preseason top 5. Vince Dooley was never preseason top 5, ever. I think Mark Richt had 3 preseason top 5 teams. Maybe once they were preseason 1. You look at the string of games with Georgia's, 31 or 32 in a row at home. That is a record for the school, and they've done it against elite competition in an era where the portal and NIL balances the field. So not only is Kirby setting records, but he's doing it in an era that has greater parity than ever before. So before you get too down on the Dogs or feel too sorry for yourselves, just realize there's so many programs that would kill for that. And remember this note, because this flabbergasted me. Kirby Smart has a better winning percentage at Georgia than Steve Spurrier had at Florida in the 1990s. That is how good Georgia football is right now.
And one day we'll all be eating at the Kirby Smart Steakhouse in Athens, GA. Good stuff, Mike. Have fun tonight. Look forward to reading your stuff from tonight on DawgNation.com. That's going to do it for us. We'll see you right back here next week, Monday night on The Beat.